Good morning, everyone. We're happy to welcome you to today's program, Herzl and Friends When Zionism Was New. Our guest author is Rachel Cockerell, who wrote Melting Point, Family, Memory, and the Search for a Promised Land. I could even show you the cover of the book. Reading this captivating book is like stepping through a time portal. Immediately, you meet Theodor Herzl and other early Zionists. They are desperate to find a homeland for the Jewish people. A Jewish state in Palestine is only one of several options. We know how the 20th century will unfold, but they do not. And if they had made different choices, who knows? Maybe the history we know or the present that we live in would be different. Melting Point is full of such unstated, provocative questions. This morning, Rachel will discuss Melting Point in conversation with Michael Zeldin. You'll hear more about both Rachel and Michael in a moment. I'm Robin Jacobson, the librarian at Adas Israel. I also facilitate Bethel's book club together with Marge London, who's here today too. This program is sponsored by Adas Israel in Washington, D.C. and Congregation Bethel in Bethesda, Maryland. We're grateful for the longtime support of the Adas Israel Sisterhood, the Women of Bethel, the Library Committee, and Men's Club. We also appreciate the many people who are joining us from other communities in the DC area, from around the United States, and from Canada. You are all very welcome. As usual, Marge and I chose Zoom backgrounds connected to our guest author's book. I am in room 117 of the Hotel of the Three Kings in Basel, Switzerland. This was Theodor Herzl's room while he led the First Zionist Congress. You can even see behind me the balcony where an iconic photo of Herzl was taken. I'll drop a link to the photo in the chat. You will recognize it right away. And when you see Marge, you'll find her also in Basel by a lovely Rhine riverscape that is close to the view Herzl saw from his hotel balcony. Before Marge introduces our guest, let me mention the next online book program. On Sunday, January 11th, we will host historian Andrew Porwancher to talk about his new work of nonfiction, American Maccabee, Theodore Roosevelt and the Jews. Come to find out, many of the questions Teddy Roosevelt grappled with are freshly relevant and urgent today. These include questions about the limits of free speech, the place of diversity in hiring decisions, the role of the United States in confronting human rights abuses in foreign countries, and the extent to which immigrants should assimilate. This issue of assimilation is also central to today's book, Melting Point. We are fortunate that the interviewer for the January program will again be Michael Zeldin. The registration link for the Teddy Roosevelt and the Jews program is in the chat. And now Marge will introduce today's guests.
It's a pleasure for me to welcome and introduce Rachel Cockerell. Rachel is a writer and historian born and raised in London. She holds a bachelor's degree from the Courtauld Institute and a master's in journalism from City University. Melting Point, her first book, is the product of 5 years of research that took Rachel to Ohio, Michigan, Texas, New York, Tel Aviv, and Jerusalem. Since its publication, the book has been racking up starred reviews and accolades. Rachel will be in conversation with Michael Zeldin. Michael is the host of the podcast, That Said with Michael Zeldin, which explores the ideas, events, and people shaping our world. Michael is also a TV and radio legal and political affairs analyst. He has served as a federal prosecutor, private sector lawyer, law professor, and global consulting firm principal. We look forward to Rachel and Michael's conversation about Melting Point. At the end of the program, there will be some time for audience questions. To ask a question, please write it in the chat box. You can submit a question at any time during the program. We'll save your questions for the Q&A at the end. Also, the link to purchase Melting Point with a discount is in the chat. Welcome, Rachel and Michael. Robin will bring you on screen.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Michael.
How are you?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Good. You're in San Francisco. Sorry it's so early for you.
Oh, that's all right. I forgive you.
All right. I didn't pick the time. So before we dive into Melting Point, tell us a bit about yourself, Rachel, and why you chose to write this book.
Sure. And also, I just want to thank Robin and Marge for those very lovely and colorful introductions. Um, why did I choose to write this book? I kind of fell into it by chance. As Marge said, I did a master's degree in journalism, and I kind of thought maybe I would become a journalist. I have many siblings, and some of them are journalists. My parents are both journalists. And so I actually, during my master's, I went on a trip to Tel Aviv, where I knew that some sort of distant family members of mine were. And I decided to interview a few of them, particularly my dad's cousin, Judy, who was born in 1940, and who's very articulate and sort of speaks in a just beautiful, sort of evocative way. And I wanted to sort of capture some of her stories on a microphone. So I interviewed her, and then I also interviewed my dad, and I kind of got to thinking that maybe I could sort of piece these interviews together and to tell the story of my dad's upbringing in North London during and after World War II. He grew up in a sort of slightly shambolic, chaotic, huge sort of crumbling house in North London with his siblings, his cousins, including Judy, who, as I said, now lives in Tel Aviv, his parents, Judy's parents, his grandmother, his great aunt, and also just various other people who came and went. So there were around sort of 13 or 14 people in this house at any one time. All the adults were Russian Jewish immigrants. That this family had come from the Russian Empire just as World War I broke out. So all the adults spoke Russian, apart from one, my grandfather, Grandpa Hugh, who was sort of a slightly sort of stiff upper lip Englishman who had married into this family of Russian Jews. And he was sort of the odd man out. So I thought this would just be something I could either write an article about or make a little sort of radio piece about. And then it just kept on evolving from there. I kept on finding out more and more about my family. And I realized that this was going to have to be a bigger story. It was not just this sort of domestic, narrow story of one family in the 1940s in Kilburn in London. It was, I think, every family is sort of intertwined with history in unusual ways, particularly in the 20th century. And that was the case for my family as well.
Right. And we'll dive into this, including sort of what set you on this path, the discovery of your great-grandfather, David Jockelman, but we'll hold who he was and what role he played in early Zionism for a minute, because I want to first, now that we know who you are and why you wrote this book, what really struck me is the style of the book. It's nothing like, I've read 180 books in my podcast in the last 3.5 years. No book is written like yours. So give us a little bit about that, please.
Well, I'll take that as a compliment.
It was intended as a compliment.
Yeah, I mean, people do say it's very, very unusual, and I never know quite what they mean by that. I kind of again sort of came to this form of writing sort of accidentally. as I was telling this, I guess that it was sort of the seed of it was always there when I first was interviewing members of my family. I thought, what if I could weave these interviews together without my voice in there? I imagined, so I didn't want to have a sort of voiceover by me, this sort of random 21st century woman sort of bringing it all together when I wasn't there in North London in, 1945 and so on. So I think it was always in my mind to not be a character in this book. And I guess I sort of took that to the logical conclusion. I took my own voice out altogether. In my early drafts, I had my own voice. I think partly because I wanted to just write a sort of normal book, a nice conventional sort of Jewish family memoir. I had read books which I'm sure many people in the audience will have read, like East West Street by Philippe Sands and The Hair with Amber Eyes by Edmund de Waal. And I kind of wanted to write something which was in that lineage. And then I gradually realized that they were both, Philippe Sands and Edmund de Waal were both sort of characters in those stories. They were sort of discovering their families and going across Europe and finding traces of their families. And I didn't want the book to be set in the 21st century whatsoever. I wanted it to be almost like a time machine taking you back to the early 20th century. So I took my voice out and I let the sources and these sort of voices from the past speak for themselves. I wanted to tell the whole story through the eyes of those who were there. And because I was working on this book during the pandemic, I was kind of in my own world. I didn't really share the book with anyone for a long time. It felt kind of like this sort of secret thing I was working on that no one close to me really understood what I was doing. But I kind of got used to the form quite quickly. So the form on the page, if anyone hasn't read it, is sort of snippets, some 1 line long, some 4 pages long, everything in between, from newspapers, diaries, letters, interviews, and they'll in the margin there'll just be the person's name who's speaking. It's kind of a bit like a play. So I had this strange form, but it felt to me very intuitive. It felt like the sort of right way to tell this story. And then I sent the manuscript to my sister, after maybe 2 or 3 years of working on it. And she instantly called me up and said, there must be some mistake. I don't know what this is you've sent me, but this can't be the book you're working on. It's just a load of notes. So she got a bit panicked that I had just been sort of, the whole thing had been a colossal waste of time. But I talked her around in the end.
So what's interesting about it for the listening audience is it's not written sort of in paragraph form with you telling the story. What you have really are characters speaking to one another. It's as if you've got a whole group of diaries and you're saying, oh, well, on this date, this character wrote this in their diary and this person wrote that in the diary. And what we read are the diary entries, but it still flows so lovely, almost as if it were an historical novel as I was reading it, as I got accustomed to reading and just watching the characters talk to one another.
That's exactly what I wanted. I wanted it to feel like a historical novel. Some history books you sort of read and you feel like a good person because you're learning facts about things and you're educating yourself. I didn't want that. I wanted something which sort of plucked you out of 2025 and placed you back, at the first Zionist Congress or in Galveston or in North London. And as you said, the importance of having the characters talk to each other as if they're all sort of arguing with each other and backing each other up, and it's almost like, yeah, you're being sort of, someone sort of grabbed you by the hand and is leading you through the first half of the 20th century.
That's right. And not only do you have the characters speaking to one another, but you have the press accounts describing the events about which they are speaking. So it's just brilliant, I think, Rachel. It's lovely. I thank you for writing it that way. It was a great treat. So for the listening audience, the book is in 3 parts. Vienna Basel is sort of the first part, London the second, and New York the third. We're going to focus, because of time, principally on part 1, but don't think for a minute at the end of this interview, well, I know all there is to know about this book because there is so much that we are not covering. So it's definitely a to-buy book. So let's dive in. In part one, we are at the outset introduced to Theodor Herzl. And for the listening audience, they'll probably recognize the name as one of the founders of the early Zionist movement. But he's an interesting character. He was a journalist, not really, he was not a rabbi or anything like that. So tell us about Herzl.
I didn't really know much about Herzl before I started writing this book, maybe partly because I am an assimilated quarter Jew living in London, and spent most of my history lessons at school looking out the window. So I think I missed the Herzl lessons. But I've spoken to lots of people since the book came out, and I think it is quite a common thing that our perception of Herzl is that he was some sort of great thinker of the past, maybe a sort of political leader or statesman in some way, founder of, maybe people know that he was the founder of modern Zionism. But I don't think we really have a sense of Herzl as a man. So I tried to sort of make him more human in this book. He founded Zionism when he was, I think, in his late 30s, early 40s. And he was a journalist, very much an assimilated Jewish journalist living in Vienna, Hungarian Jewish. And he wrote this little pamphlet, I think partly because he thought it might be a way of sort of doing some more serious work because his journalism felt to him quite trivial. He would write these sort of funny and clever little columns about cafe life in Vienna or about something his daughter had done that day. And he wrote in his diary, that this bigger, sort of grander idea hovers over his sort of more trivial journalistic work. So he sort of founded Zionism by accident, and wrote in his diary, perhaps I'll bring the Jews back to their ancient homeland of Palestine, and if not, at least I can make it into a novel titled The Promised Land.
Right. So he is an assimilated Jew in Vienna, writing as a journalist, and he has sort of an epiphany, and I'd like your opinion about this. Some suggest that it was in the aftermath of the Dreyfus affair. Dreyfus is a Jewish French army captain accused of essentially espionage for the Germans. It begins in 1894, and some say that was a tipping point for Herzl. That's when he sort of found his Judaism, because he was really hidden as a Jew in Vienna. Do you have a point of view on Dreyfus, or if not, we can just go forward?
Yeah, I early in my research, I read that historians are a bit conflicted about how much Dreyfus had an impact on Herzl. I think maybe it was more. I think maybe that was a factor, but I feel like it was more about his own ego. I wanted everyone in this book to be sort of flawed three-dimensional characters. Herzl is obviously sort of someone who has changed the world and was hugely intelligent and charismatic and drew people to him, and could have was very statesmanlike, but he did have an ego, and I think that played a huge role in his decision to found the modern Zionist movement. I think there was a lot of sort of he had a lot of sort of self-regard, and I think he had sort of these grand visions of himself as the sort of first leader of a modern Jewish state. So I think that was in his mind all the time. He has these volumes and volumes of diaries, and most of it is just what do people think of me, etc.
Yeah, it's funny to be in your 30s and thinking about your legacy, but that seems to be what he was involved in, Dreyfus or not. And again, to the listening audience who have not read the book, you quote because you have, as if you have diaries. Maybe they actually were diaries or letters, but you have first source material. And Herzl writes, and I'll read it. I apologize for turning left, but he says, of the pamphlet, The Jewish State, which he writes in 1895, for some time I have been occupied with the work of indefinite grandeur. At the moment, I do not know if I shall complete it. It has the appearance of a dream, but for days and weeks it has possessed me beyond the limits of consciousness. It accompanies me wherever I go. It hovers over my ordinary conversation, looks over my shoulder at my comical, trivial, journalistic work, haunts me and intoxicates me. So that's his thought process, right? As he's writing in 1895, this little pamphlet.
Yeah, it's funny. He always said, my book. Oh, I'm writing my book. He always called it my book, and everyone else called it his pamphlet because it was only sort of 60 pages long or something. But yeah, he just became totally obsessed with this thing. And there's, I think, a few lines after that in Melting Point. He gives the manuscript, as he calls it, to one of his friends. And watches his friend as he's reading it, and his friend starts crying, and Herzl thinks, "Oh yes, it's true. What a profoundly moving book I've written." And his friend just turns to him and says, "I think you've gone mad. What are you thinking? Bringing the Jews back to Palestine? What could you like? How could you have how could you have come up with this?" The other thing that I didn't really put in my book is that Herzl didn't really realize that the Zionist movement had this huge precedent, and that other people had written about this and sort of thought about it very seriously for many years before Herzl wrote his book. And I think he wrote later, if I had sort of known a bit more, then maybe I wouldn't have thought that I was having such an original idea.
Yeah, it's interesting. So he writes this pamphlet in 1895. It calls for the Jews to return to Palestine as their homeland. And he's now going about essentially promoting his idea, and met with modest success. But he writes again in one of his diaries or letters that as he's going about this process, not knowing whether it'll be realizable or not, the center of gravity turns to London in late 1895. And remember, the pamphlet is not published until 1896. So he's 1895, he's got this idea, he's wandering around giving it to people who said he's gone mad. He says, well, maybe I've gone mad, but at least I have the seeds of a novel here. But it takes us to London, where Herzl meets Israel Zangwill. So who's Zangwill, and why?
Yeah.
Why Zangwill?
It's funny, this moment when Herzl goes from Vienna to London for a visit. It feels like this kind of world historical event, and yet it had this sort of butterfly effect, which eventually led to my own family being in London. It's strange to sort of be able to trace things back. There's this phrase in the book, the unresting chain of events, the butterfly effect or the domino effect, where you see how two seemingly totally unrelated events are linked together by all these many, many links. And I'm sure everyone listening has that in their own family as well. You think, the reason I am in, Washington, or wherever I am, is because of all these events which seem so unrelated, going back maybe 100 years or more. So Herzl goes to London and meets, everyone tells him, oh, you must meet Israel Zangwill. He's a sort of prominent Jewish writer in London. And Herzl does, and both of them write about it afterwards. And they both have quite different memories of this night. Herzl has sort of driven, Zangwill lives in North London, and by the time Herzl gets there, I think he says, long ride through endless winding streets. I arrived feeling a bit out of sorts. So I think he was a bit car sick, or like horse-drawn carriage sick by the time he got there. And I've actually had that experience. My uncle still lives in the house in North London where my dad grew up. And I always arrive there feeling a bit out of sorts. It's kind of something about, we don't really have the grid system in London like you guys do in America. So you're sort of turning and turning, and you do feel a bit out of sorts when you arrive in North London. But Herzl and Zangwill both wrote about this afterwards. I don't know if you have the quote there or if I should just paraphrase it.
Well, what Herzl says, and I don't know if this is the quote, what Zangwill says is a black bearded stranger knocked at my study door like one dropped from the skies and said, "I'm Theodor Herzl. Help me rebuild the Jewish state." And Zangwill goes on to say, "I never even heard of this guy." And Herzl will write, I never read anything that Zangwill wrote, but I thought I sort of knew him. So
Yeah.
very odd.
Yeah, it's funny, Herzl kind of says like, "Oh, I know of Zangwill. I've heard of him." And Zangwill slightly sort of boastfully says, "Oh, I'd never heard of Theodor Herzl then." And that kind of characterizes, this is our first introduction to Zangwill, who's really sort of, I guess, the sort of protagonist of this book, despite the fact it was meant to be a family memoir and he's no relation to me. But Zangwill is quite sort of grandiose and always sort of being a bit self-aggrandizing and saying, oh Herzl, I had never heard of him at that point, but he had heard of me, is classic Zangwill. These two men present sort of polar opposites. Herzl, I think I mentioned earlier, was very handsome, beautifully dressed, very charismatic. If you were sort of walking along the street in Vienna and you met Herzl coming in the opposite direction, you would just do a U-turn and walk with him, because wherever he was going was probably more interesting than wherever you had planned to go. He was sort of the darling of Vienna. Zangwill was sort of the darling of London, but people had a sort of people were affectionately rude about him. They said that he was the worst dressed man in London and the ugliest man in the world. He had sort of crazy hair, was always stumbling around, carrying manuscripts under his arm, dropping pieces of paper, scribbling things down, then putting them in his pocket. Always sort of straying into the road and about to get run over by a horse-drawn carriage. But he wrote these books which the British and the American public became obsessed with. He was a sort of bestseller, sort of celebrity author in at the turn of the century. And I guess his most famous book is Children of the Ghetto. And that was a novel about Jewish life in London, the sort of Jewish ghetto of London. So Herzl goes to London to meet the sort of London's most famous novelist, or really the English-speaking world's most famous Jewish novelist. He was sort of called the Dickens of the ghetto, and he really, he kind of gets Zangwill on board to sort of help with Zionism. And eventually Zangwill, for a while, abandons his career as a novelist altogether and becomes sort of swept up in Zionism and becomes swept up in Herzl's Zionism. I think he, like everyone else, sort of almost falls in love with Herzl. And so he sort of drops everything in his life for the sake of Zionism.
Right. And so the two of them embark upon proselytizing, if that's a word you can use about a Jewish transcript, his idea of a promised land in Palestine. And the pamphlet gets published in 1896 as they embark upon their campaign. And how was it received? What was the reaction globally, if you will, to this 60-page pamphlet, The Promised Land?
Originally, it was received very badly. Everyone in Vienna sort of turned and laughed at Herzl. They would sort of mock him behind his back. His friends would say, is this pamphlet you've written a joke, or is it meant to be serious? And then there is this sort of larger sort of this response, which I think one person says it sort of roars back at Herzl from the Jews of the Russian Empire. Herzl's name is sort of whispered from town to town, and people sort of acquire pictures of him. and almost sort of, it's like a rumor of Herzl sort of spreads across the Russian Empire, much like something would go viral today. But if you think of the challenge of something going viral when, you know, there's no electricity and no internet and so on back in at the turn of the 20th century, it seems amazing that that word could spread across such a huge empire, or I guess the Pale of Settlement. So the word spreads, and it's really the Russian Jews who respond to Herzl's idea of modern Zionism more than anyone else, more than the assimilated Jews of Europe, more than the Jews of America, and they sort of bring Zionism to life.
Yeah, and Chaim Weizmann, in writing about this, again, this is the wonder of your book, is that you have these people talking to one another, as I've said. Weizmann writes that of Herzl that he became a monumental, mythical Jewish figure. Herzl's brochure did not remain just on paper. The message soon passed to every town, great and small, in Poland and Russia, in which there was a Jewish ghetto.
Right.
Remarkable stuff.
Yeah.
So they set about this. They've got this pamphlet. They're well known now in every shtetl in Poland and Russia and in between. And they've got to operationalize their idea. And that brings us to the first Jewish Congress in Basel in 1897. So tell us about what was going on there.
Yeah, so Herzl convened this first sort of first ever worldwide meeting of the Jews in Basel in 1897, and I think delegates from, you know, many continents arrived in Basel in the summer of 1897. Herzl instructed everyone to wear evening wear, so, you know, shirt and tie, sort of tailcoats, and it was really, you know, this idea that we could just find a way to create a Jewish state in Palestine probably quite quickly. You know, Herzl's parting words to the Zionist Congress were next year in Jerusalem. Obviously, this, you know, this line that's used in the Passover ceremony, but I think he really meant it, or thought he meant it, that Zionism would be a year-long project. Maybe it would all be sort of wrapped up by 1898, and there would be a Jewish state. And I think, you know, Herzl had no notion of this sort of vast century-long machine that he was setting into motion, or, you know, more than a century now. Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, Rachel, you quote him as saying, "At Basel, I founded the Jewish state." You know, not so fast, right? Not so fast.
Right.
But I want to talk about one thing at Basel before we go forward with it. At Basel, they adopt the Basel program, which is the outline for the Jewish settlement in Palestine. But one line that struck me in the program itself, it says, Zionism seeks to establish a home in Palestine for the Jewish people secured by public international law. So it was important to them in this 1897 Congress that what they do be secured under public international law, that they weren't about to come in there as colonialists, but rather they had a notion that they would go there, they would purchase the land from the Ottoman Empire, the Brits, wealthy Arabs who owned a lot of this privately owned land, and it was sold, and they invited. Herzl says the expedient promotion of the settlement of Jewish agriculturalists, artisans, and tradesmen in Palestine. So I raise this because of this notion of pre-48 settlers, conquest, colonialist, but that wasn't really not what they had in mind, was it?
No, it wasn't. I think Herzl always wanted Zionism to be a sort of a political movement which it was impossible not to accept. You know, he didn't want to cut any corners or give anyone in the world a reason to doubt the legitimacy of Zionism. So it was always that that a Jewish state would be self-governed and would be sort of official in every way possible. And I think, yeah, I mean, it's strange looking at the way everything has turned out. I think that Herzl would be quite shocked by this movement that he brought into being, the way it sort of strayed from his ideas of what he wanted it to be.
Yeah. So Herzl, post 1897, and with Zangel's assistants, are going around meeting people. They meet with Joseph Chamberlain, famous later of the father of Neville Chamberlain, and they've got ideas for purchasing property. They want to purchase the Sinai, curiously, but the Egyptian government says no, thank you. We're not selling. And they're looking at this, and their timeline is expanding. And then there's a critical moment in 1903 in Kishinev. So tell us about that.
Yeah, the Kishinev pogrom really brought Zionism into sharp focus, at least, but for the Jews, but also for non-Jews around the world, to see that the Jews really did need a refuge, that the Russian Empire was not a welcoming or safe place for the Jews to be. I'm sure a lot of people here already know about it, or know about pogroms, and I'm sure you all know about pogroms, that Russian Christians would sort of rampage through the streets, destroying Jewish property and injuring and killing Jews. And one survivor of the Kishinev pogrom, this was in what is now Moldova, in which at the time was in the Russian Empire, said, "May God grant that I will soon be able to turn my back upon this bloody country." So it was really, that was the moment when Jews, it was just, yeah, a turning point where Jews sort of decided en masse that it was time to leave the Russian Empire.
There is an imperative. I mean, in Kishinev, which was one of these post-Easter massacres, it seems like Christians around the time of Easter always got whipped up into a frenzy, and they kill 50 Jews. They gravely injure about 100. They destroy 1,500 houses, and there's now an imperative that Herzl feels that maybe waiting till Palestine becomes a reality is not possible. And so we're at the 6th Basel Conference in 1903, and Herzl proposes the possibility of a Jewish settlement in East Africa, the so-called Uganda Plan. So tell us about that.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Joseph Chamberlain, father of Neville, says to Herzl that he's been on a sort of journey through the British colonies in East Africa, and the British and the Americans had built a railway line through East Africa called the Uganda Railway, which went through several countries. And Chamberlain had been on board and had glanced out the window and seen sort of rolling countryside, which reminded him of the English countryside. So he came back to London and said to Herzl, "I've seen a land for you on my travels, and that's Uganda. English roses bloom profusely. It's much like the Sussex Downs. It's yours if you want it, but maybe it's too far away from Palestine." And Herzl again writes in his diary that he feels that he has no choice but to submit this offer to the Jewish people just to see what they think of him, of it. That it's not really his choice, that it should be the choice of the Jews. And so he does present that offer at the next Zionist Congress, and it all goes quite catastrophically wrong.
Well, it's interesting. He proposes it. I mean, he was a Zionism in Zion guy. Then Kishinev happens, and he's thinking, well, maybe Zionism without Zion is a possibility. And so I'll submit to the 6th Congress this offer of land in Uganda. And it's fiercely debated, as you say, but the delegates vote 295 in favor and 178 against, to at least send an exploratory committee to go look at you. I'm sure these Polish and Russian Jews had no idea where Uganda even was on a map, but they send out this exploratory committee, which will come back in 1905 to the Seventh Congress, and tell us about that. So what happens? They send out the exploratory committee. They come back in 1905 with their report, and what happens?
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, it is a history book, but I kind of don't want total sort of spoilers because the Uganda plan is. I feel like the drama of it all has been kind of forgotten, and it's quite nice to sort of rely on people's sort of patchy knowledge of history and of the Zionist movement, so that everything is a bit of a surprise in the book. But yeah, it is quite a catastrophe. And I'll just give you one newspaper account from the time, which says that Uganda is a land filled with wild beasts and savages, and therefore perhaps it's not quite the perfect Jewish homeland.
And it is then at the next Congress rejected. Yes?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Which causes us to encounter your great-grandfather, David Jockelman, and Israel Zangwill again, as they break from the Zionists, the Herzl Zionists. Herzl is dead. He's died in 1904. He's not seeing the consequence of his actions, but they formed the International Jewish International Organization, the ITO. What was up? What was up with that?
Yeah, Zangwill was sort of wanting to carry on Herzl's legacy and find a Jewish homeland somewhere on Earth, and so he set up this organization with the terrible name, the Jewish Territorial Organization. It's not as catchy as Zionism by a long shot, and his sort of motto really was, if we cannot get the Holy Land, we can make another land holy. And my great-grandfather became his vice president, and together they sort of searched the world for some sort of temporary, either alternative to Palestine or sort of, temporary refuge. And I mean, I go through in the book the ways this goes wrong as well, and it's all their sort of searches sort of come to nothing, and then finally the thing that does work is Galveston. Galveston becomes a sort of temporary promised land.
Right. So 1903, they are searching for new land all over the place, Western Africa, Western Canada. They want to buy a state in the United States. I mean, it's comical in a sense and sad in another sense, but that's what they're doing. And you bring us to essentially 1907 and the Galveston movement, and that forms a big part of the book. And can you just tell us about it a little bit more? Again, I'm always cautious not to spoil the book for prospective readers, but tell us about Galveston. What was it that was in the minds? And this is Schiff and others bringing people from Russia to the United States before World War I in response to the pogroms, because this 1880 to 1940, 1914 is about the most deadly pogroms that Russia experienced over a long history of pogroms. So what was going on in Galveston movement?
Yeah, sure. And maybe after this, should we open it up to questions? I can see a lot of questions coming through in the chat. Galveston was really chosen by both the American Jews and by Zangwill and my great-grandfather as an alternative to New York. The Lower East Side of New York was, in sort of 1905, the greatest Jewish center the world had ever known. If you walked through the streets of the Lower East Side, it would feel like you were stepping into another country. It felt like you were sort of walking through a Russian Jewish town. It was you felt like you hadn't left Russia if you were on the Lower East Side, and German Jews who had been in New York a little longer, bankers like Jacob Schiff, saw this sort of huge crest of immigration, these boats arriving at Ellis Island every day, there were no quotas on Jewish immigration at that time. They saw this sort of huge mass of Jewish immigration as something which might and already was creating a sort of menace to the longer established Jews of America, that perhaps the Americans would turn against the Jews as immigrants. So Galveston was a sort of alternative and a way for the ships to sort of bypass New York altogether, and for Jews to still arrive in America, but to spread out across the American hinterland. So the idea was that a Jewish immigrant would get off the ship at the port of Galveston and would then take a train further inland. And this is what happened for 7 years. 10,000 Russian Jews came to Galveston. It's called the Galveston movement, and it's kind of been totally forgotten, apart from, I guess, by the descendants of Galveston immigrants and by one plaque outside the synagogue in Galveston, which I sort of made a pilgrimage to a couple of years ago while I was writing the book. And it's strange, because I was writing this during the pandemic. I kind of sometimes wondered if it was all a figment of my imagination, Herzl and Zangwill and the Galveston Plan and everything else that came afterwards. And it's, as a historian, having those moments where you see sort of some trace of what you're writing about in the world are kind of quite thrilling and sort of quite powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. But before we turn to questions, and we'll get to that in a moment, can you talk about Zangwill's play, The Melting Pot? And I mean, maybe your title of the book, The Melting Point, is a riff on it in some sense, but tell us about The Melting Pot, because that invites what we'll talk about in January about Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt goes to see this play by Zangwill called The Melting Pot and talk about it, because it also raises the question of tradition versus assimilation, which was important at that time and actually quite important to your family.
Yeah, I mean, assimilation is kind of what I was always thinking about while writing this book. Zangwill writes to Roosevelt and says, "Dear President Roosevelt, I've written a new play about the experience of being an American. Will you come and see it? The premiere is in Washington, D.C. on, I think it was October the 2nd, 1908. And Roosevelt comes to the premiere, as does every other sort of famous figure in Washington at that time. This night of the premiere, if you were in the audience, you sort of couldn't help but look around you and see all these celebrities, in their boxes, dressed in their finery. And people said it was sort of, when the curtain went up, people thought, how on earth am I going to concentrate on the play when there are all these, there's a president and whoever else in the audience. But this play Zangwill had written, despite being a British Jew, he had written what some called the great American play. It was about two immigrants who come to America, fall in love, cast aside their differences, and melt into the melting pot and emerge as shiny new Americans. And it all ends happily ever after, and how wonderful the melting pot is. And there was sort of standing ovations and people were clapping and cheering, and Roosevelt apparently shouted over the balustrade from his box, "It's a great play, Mr. Zangwill." And that line was used on all the adverts in the newspapers after that. And then the play went on tour across America. And if you can imagine, again, it's kind of similar to something going viral in modern times. This whole country was talking about the idea of the melting pot. And those years of the play being on tour in America sort of solidified this phrase, the melting pot, as a piece of American vocabulary. People didn't use the phrase the melting pot before then, apart from for what it really meant, which is like a cauldron for, or maybe not a cauldron, some sort of pot for melting down your sort of precious jewelry to make into new things, precious metals and so on. So it wasn't used as a metaphor before Zangwill sort of coined that phrase. And this idea of assimilation, I guess, I'm sure everyone here has certain feelings about it, and maybe certain mixed feelings about it within your own family. You know, I, for one, feel that I have melted into the melting pot, and I feel like I've lost so much of my Jewishness, or so much of my grandmother's Jewishness. And so this sort of bittersweet idea of the melting pot was something that I wanted to sort of explore, but I didn't feel like I could ever reach a conclusion about it. Even now, I feel sort of undecided about it all, and maybe being undecided is the sort of the best way to be.
You write in the afterword that Zangwill, of all the characters, came most alive to you. And I was wondering, in your reflections on Zangwill and this play, was he promoting assimilation? Was he conflicted about the difference between assimilation and maintaining one's tradition? How should we analyze what he was telling us in that play? Because it portends what happens in your family, where, to the listening audience, half of your family remains non-practicing Jews or not Jewish really, in London. The other half goes off to Jerusalem and become practicing Jews.
Yeah.
So what was Engel telling us?
I mean, I think Zhang was also either changing his mind or was actually just in two minds about it. He said to one journalist, I think for the New York Herald, America is the euthanasia of the Jews. If I had my way, not a single Russian Jew would enter America. And then he was also proclaiming, you know, he was the leader of the Galveston Project. So he was proclaiming that America was, you know, the great American West was the new home for the Jews, and that we should forget about Palestine and send all the Jews to Palestine, Texas, which apparently is a real place. And reviewers, you know, for this play wrote, can Zangwill really believe that the answer to the Jewish question is melting into the melting pot? Surely he cannot believe this sort of deep in his heart. And some of them had sort of almost conspiracy theories that Zangwill had written this piece of propaganda in order to suck up to Theodore Roosevelt, who had said things like, and immigrants coming from the old world must cast off their sort of barbarous old world ways and revere only one flag, the American flag. No other flag can even come second. So yeah, reviewers thought, you know, is Zangwill just pandering to Roosevelt and to Roosevelt's idea as America, as a place where people are Americans and not you know, Irish Americans or Chinese Americans or Italian Americans. They're just Americans.
Mm.
So yeah, I feel like there was a little bit of truth in that maybe Zangwill was doing a little bit of pandering, but I'd like to ask him.
Yeah, well, you've got a lot of the original source materials to try to ask him again. But what was so interesting, again, when we trace how did you get to write this book this way? David Jockelman, your great-grandfather, and Zangwill were at the very heart of this movement. And your great-grandfather's activities was more or less unknown to you at the outset of this project.
That's right. And yeah, I think this will be the last thing I say because I know that we're running out of time. Yeah, my great grandfather had been forgotten by his own family, by my family. Everyone said to me, you know, don't bother looking into him. He's very boring. And then, you know, there are a few people who write about the Galveston Project, you know, academics at various universities in America, who I emailed, and one of them wrote to me back saying, oh my God, you're Jockelman's great granddaughter, very big deal. So he's been sort of remembered by a few people, and but for yeah, I guess this whole book was sort of bringing back so much that has been forgotten from the past.
Right, and as we said, there are three parts to the book, and the London part, the third part, really explores sort of the lineage from David Jockelman through your family in London when they're all together, 17 of them in this chaotic house, which is so much fun to read, to the split. Fanny stays in, one great aunt stays in London, and you are raised not Jewish, and the other go to Israel and are Zionists. And you've got this yin and yang in your own family. which you write about in part 3, which is why you have to buy the book.
Yeah.
Maybe
How
it's
should
So, Robin, maybe we can turn to questions now. I know we're close to the end of our hour, but you promised that we could bleed a little bit into the second hour to answer some questions. So if you could curate the questions that you think are most appropriate, that would be lovely.
Yeah, happy to do that. But first, thank you both for such a fabulous and fascinating conversation. And let's look in the chat for questions. So so Richard and Andrea wanted to know if there wasn't any Herzl, were there sort of would-be Herzls in the wings? Were there other people who were championing the idea of Jews returning to Palestine?
Oh, I have no idea, and maybe someone else should write a book about that. This sometimes happens where there are all these interesting sort of side strands, and there are so many other books that could be written.
And Barbara asks about your great-grandfather's first marriage. He had a family before he came to London. Was this a big shock to you when you learned it, or did you already know about that?
It was a huge shock. I had never heard of any of my relatives from my great grandfather's first family. And then one day I said to my dad, "Have you ever heard of M. Joe Bashe?" And he said yes, but it turned out that he had heard of a different M. Joe Bashe. There were two M. Joe Bashes, and both of them were related to me. And my dad had met one of them when he was a 10-year-old boy, but there was another one as well. It was all a huge mystery, and that I sort of unravel in the book as well. But yeah, he almost it had almost this was when I was sort of 25 or something that he said, "Oh yeah, of course I remember M. Joe Bashe." But it's like he had waited 25 years for me to just ask it, for it to come up in conversation.
And can I add one thing about Mjo Bashi? And there's Mjo Bashi and then the daughter who goes by Joe Bashi, which is the source of the confusion. But Mjo Bashi, your, I guess, relative through your great-grandfather's prior marriage, becomes one of the great avant-garde experimental theater writers. He and John Dos Passos formed the New Playwrights Theater at a time when Impressionism and experimental theater was just coming into its own in America. And so that London chapter is really fascinating from that point of view as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Marion asks Rachel, how did writing this book affect your own Jewish identity?
I kind of thought that it would make me more Jewish, but I think it's just given me more of a sense of what I've lost, what parts of myself and my family have sort of melted into the melting pot. Um, I guess I know so much more now, but I don't know if it has made me more Jewish.
Although I can tell you, Rachel, if you'd like, both Addis and Bethel do adult bat mitzvah classes if you want to sign up. I'm sure they'd be happy to have you as a student, right, Robin? And
Yes, the doors to you are always open.
Right.
Henry asks what Herzl imagined about the Jewish state. If it had actually been formed in his lifetime, what was he thinking? Was it going to be sort of a philosopher kings or a modern country like other countries? What did he have in mind?
He did actually write a novel called I think it's in German Alt Neuland, Old New Land. Um, and he laid out his sense of what Palestine, a Jewish state in Palestine would be like. And yeah, I think he imagined it as a very modern country with beautiful, clean streets and artists and poets and everything sort of functioning perfectly. He had this line, "If you will it, it is no dream." And this idea of the dream of a Jewish state in Palestine, can it ever live up to that dream, was something that I wanted to explore as well.
that's right. And in fact, Robin, to that point, she writes about this Shangri-La notion of Palestine that Herzl had, but then the sort of the hardline territorialists who thought that it was perhaps morally wrong to go to Palestine. They write that they were disturbed by the possibility of a Zionist state in Palestine because it would require, and this was so prescient, it would require, they write in the early 1900s, it would require the militarization of a Jewish society, a development for which there was ethically and religiously un-Jewish and therefore unacceptable.
Yeah, it's also fascinating. Leah grew up in Galveston in the 1930s and 40s, and she actually met Rabbi Cohen. He was a friend of her grandfather, and they used to study together, and her grandmother served refreshments. Maybe you could say something about Rabbi Cohen because he was so
Oh,
important in the Galveston Plan.
oh my God. Leah, please write to me. I mean, one of the joys of this book has been meeting people who knew the characters. I mean, it just seems amazing. I think Rabbi Cohen was born in the 1870s, and the fact that there are people today who remember him, I've met and spoken to a few others. Same with my great grandfather, born in 1869. My cousin Joe still remembers him. It just the way people can live on in people's memories, not even removed by one generation, is just amazing. Zangwill's descendants have written to me. There's a character in the book called Otto Kahn, and I was looking up his descendants, and I realized I saw on Wikipedia that one of his descendants is a friend of mine. And I said to my friend, is your great grandfather Otto Kahn? He said, oh yeah, sure he is. Again, it was like, oh, it's just never come up in conversation before. So, there are all these traces of the past sort of, just around us all the time, waiting for us to notice them. Rabbi Cohen was one of my favorite characters. He whizzed around Galveston on his bicycle. He was actually British and had a horrible stammer, but was the rabbi not only to Galveston, but to, as people said, the whole of Texas. There was this sort of little song composed about him. From all the towns of Texas, from Fort Worth to San Antone, there's not a man who hasn't heard of Rabbi Henry Cohen. So, he was a very delightful character.
He sounds very wonderful. There's a question here about your academic background. I think people were curious. You have a first degree from Courtauld. Is that an art institute? Was your background in art before you turned to history?
Yeah, it was a history of art degree, so I focused on medieval Italy. So I guess it was sort of history in a way, and it was essay writing and learning how to express ideas clearly. But while I was there, I kind of thought like, not sure if this is totally right for me, but it's almost right. And then when I did journalism, that felt like one step closer. And now I feel that luckily sort of found the thing that I'm good at, which is piecing together primary sources, a nice useful talent to have. But I have not had a sort of proper training in history, and I think actually being a bit of an outsider can be quite useful because you're not sort of bogged down in all your knowledge. You have to start from square one and illuminate something to the reader, even as you illuminate it to yourself.
Is there a new project in the offing that will be using those skills of piecing together primary sources? Something
Yeah,
we could be on the watch for?
I think be on the watch for it in maybe like 2030, maybe 2031. Hopefully, I'll try and finish it before then, but it's again entirely told through primary sources. I wanted to show that this sort of form of writing history could be used for other things, not just for Russian Jews going to Texas.
Well, I'm convinced of that. So I look forward to seeing it. So it's time to end the program. Thank you so much, Rachel and Michael. It was a privilege to listen to your conversation. And Rachel, thank you for your book. You made me feel like I actually met Herzl and Zangwill, and that was totally thrilling. Michael or Rachel, any last comments?
So
No,
Rachel, do we say next year in Jerusalem? Is that the appropriate ending?
That seems very appropriate.
yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, Michael. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Marge. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
It was wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. And thank you for writing this book. and I hope it meets with tremendous success. It's
Thank
lovely.
you.
Yeah, wonderful.